Now, if any of this goes through, cap and trade, the medical thing that he's talking about, or any of the other are not renewing the Bush tax policies, if any of it goes through, it's going to make this thing last longer. Because what's happening is that we got to restore people's balance sheets. The problem is the balance sheets are distorted, and as you allow costs to fall, and that was the secret of supply-side economics. That was the secret of Reagan and his supply-side program. Because what did he do? He cut costs. Okay? And I can give you an example. I used to hire tool and die makers when I was in that business. Before the Reagan tax cuts, you couldn't get a tool and die maker to work on Saturday. Why? Because it put him in a higher tax bracket. He said, well, I'm not going to work for $2 an hour when I can go out in my boat. You see? So what happens is as you lower those costs, suddenly what happens, you ignite the engine. And as you lower costs, suddenly when a person goes into a bank to get a loan, he has a nice business plan. They can show that our costs are low, we're going to generate profits. And once that banker sees that, he says, yes, this is someone I can lend money to. And that starts the engine. That gets it going. So the last thing I would think we need is more government. It caused this problem. Why Alan Greenspan, when we look at Mises, could allow that credit expansion to happen twice under his regime was beyond me. But he did. And the credit, all as an expansion of credit falsely, as the interest rates are lowered falsely, it creates distortions, and that's what we're working out now. So my call would be for lot less government intervention. I think we go back and see for the supply side that Reagan did. Remember, Reagan lowered regulation, he lowered taxes. What did that do? That stimulated the economy because it created good balance sheets on the part of people going into banks. When people have a good balance sheet going into banks, the banks are willing to lend money, and then what happens? People get hired, investment starts to happen, and you start to cycle again. So I think the worst thing we could do, and if this administration continues to increase costs, and that's what this is. Everything this administration wants to do is increase cost. You're looking at probably a 10-year problem, okay, like we had in the 1930s, because that's what Roosevelt and did. They raised costs. It's lowering costs that makes the economy work. Thank you.
Okay, we've now sort of set up some issues. Next step is to ask questions. We're going to start with them asking their questions. We're going to have people coming through to look at your question cards. We can get those in. And so they finish, so you guys can start with a question of the opposite side. You can build in the rule of 1 minute rebuttal if you want. You think we all, right? So which person is moving on this?
I have a couple of questions that intrigue me here. A number of you have made Alan Greenspan out to be the villain in this piece because he kept interest rates low during the middle part of this decade and supposedly caused the housing bubble. Yet at the same time, we're told that the main job of the Federal Reserve, and this is something Brian said in his keynote, is to keep the price level steady. And that's not the price of one particular asset. He made that quite clear. The point was not to stabilize the price of gold. The point was to stabilize the general price level. Most of us think that Alan Greenspan, and certainly Alan Greenspan thinks that Alan Greenspan did a very good job of stabilizing the overall price level. Now the question is, how is Greenspan supposed to stabilize the general price level while at the same time targeting the price of a specific asset, namely housing in the 2000s and the stock market in the 1990s? Wasn't he following the Taylor rule?
I think, in a way, I disagree with targeting the price to the price level. I would prefer to target it to something external discipline like the price of gold or keeping the currency stable in international markets, rather than the price level. Because the problem with the price level is you're always behind the ball. You're always doing yesterday's price level and trying to adjust it So in a sense, I'm not in agreement with a lot of the supply centers who say it's the price level. I think we need an external discipline that we have at Bretton Woods, or we have in the gold standard where it's targeted to something external.
And I would like to just add, he was not following the Taylor Road. In fact, John Taylor's little book here has a diagram that was in The Economist that showed that, in fact, the federal funds rate was substantially below the Taylor Roll from about mid-2001 up until finally 2007.
If you take a look at the price level of the BLS statistics, what you find is that prior to the breaking of Bretton Woods in 1971, between 46 and 71, price level about doubled. Since 25 years after that, when we broke Bretton Woods, the price level quadrupled.
Can I add something real quickly about Alan Greenspan? Nobody's going to call him blameless in this whole thing, but if we look at 2005, I mean, he raised interest rates, 17 times, but it didn't have any effect on long-term interest rates. The yield curve flattened, and that's basically what they call the conundrum. Greenspan said it's the conundrum, and they couldn't explain why couldn't he lose long-term interest rates. So it wasn't the Fed doesn't control long-term interest rates, and that's really what the problem in the housing bubble was, not necessarily short-term rates. So there were other things going on there too. There was a lot of money coming in from abroad. There was this huge flood of global liquidity. Not all of it came from the Fed. I'm not saying the Fed is blameless, but not all of it came from the Fed.
I have a question for the other side. You guys put a lot more faith in what is called fiscal policy than I think we would. And so my question is this. When I think of fiscal policy, which has been elevated to a kind of science of wise people, like the Wizard of Oz behind the curtain who's manipulating everything, you'll know just exactly what to do. But when you pull the curtain away, you discover you've got 535 squabbers who are doling out money by the trillions for all sorts of political payoffs and pork barrel. Many of them don't have a clue what they're doing, and most have not run so much as a lemonade stand. So I'm wondering, on what basis do you grant politicians in Washington such enormous authority to regulate the economy by their habits of spending?
Let me reply to that in two ways. One is that fiscal policy in the long run should be responsible in the sense that we should try to make sure that the federal budget is solvent in the long run. The problem here is that in the last 8 years, we had a historic deficit during good times. So we did not have a real big deficit during good times. In bad times, I think we had a debate last night, and there was no credible alternative to government spending in the short run to bring the economy back when there was systemic failure. There was no credible alternative during the Great Depression when everything crashed, except the government to bring it back, at least in the short run. And there was no credible alternative now in terms of government stimulus package to try to bring it back, at least in the short run. In the long run, clearly, the Federal Reserve, the federal government has to balance the budget and try to reduce government spending down the road. The other issue we've talked about a lot recently is the nature of government spending. And it should be clear that there are certain kinds of spending which the private sector is not going to do. The private sector does not invest in basic R&D. Basic R&D just has two uncertain long-term payoffs. It's the federal government which spends a lot of money on basic R&D. That's the reason why, when the Nobel Prizes are announced, 90% of the Nobel Prizes are in America. Why? Because of the fact that we have a lot of money going into basic R&D. Now, the private sector can take that basic R&D and make a lot of product-related development from that basic R&D. The second issue is government has to spend on education. This whole idea of reneging on Michigan Promise. If you don't allow students in the middle class to come to universities to get skills, if you renege on the Michigan Promise in terms of subsidizing their education, we are going to position ourselves for failure in the future because we don't have the skills for the workforce we need. So government has to spend on infrastructure, government has to spend on basic R&D, government has to spend on education. The private sector cannot do these things and historically have not done these things because the benefits are to society at large. Education has a benefit to the person who educates.